Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, March 3rd, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about Nikki Haley and her now seemingly refusal to be bound by the Republican National Committee's pledge that when she announced her candidacy to run for president and when she got on the debate stage, that she would commit to eventually supporting the Republican Party's nominee. And today she says that she is no longer bound by this RNC pledge, that the RNC of the past is not the RNC of today, and thus she does not have to follow suit. Now, this is not something that we have seen entirely uncommon from candidates as they get into later on in the election cycle. President Donald Trump back in 2016 refused to acknowledge that he would endorse any of the eventual Republicans should they have eventually became the Republican nominee, and that became a problem again in 2024 when he additionally refused to endorse any Republican beside himself for the presidential nomination. And so Nikki Haley really jumped onto this very early, stating that, quite frankly, the most important threat is Joe Biden. Getting Joe Biden out of the White House is her priority, and it's not more about voting for Democrats over Republicans just because you don't win a primary. But it is clear here now that Nikki Haley feels very differently about the issue today than she did 6 months ago. When she was on the debate stage last fall, she was talking a big game about eventually supporting the Republican nominee and having a commitment to Republican ideology and in some cases even defending President Donald Trump while still criticizing some of the actions that he did in his administration. But after relentless attacks on both sides, Haley's camp and Trump's camp, against each other, it looks like that bond that once existed very strongly in the White House when she was the United Nations ambassador is no longer holding strong. And so she announces here that she is no longer bound by the RNC's commitment. And we actually saw this coming. When she was first talking about what was happening, she wasn't going to commit to backing Donald Trump in the eventual election. On February 18th, she said, "I'm running against him for a reason." She didn't say she wasn't going to vote for Joe Biden or anybody else, and that she also didn't say that she wasn't going to vote for Donald Trump. But she did say that she is running against him for a reason, and that essentially was saying that there is no guarantee that she backs him in the eventual election. And I think this also comes into play because for a while now, people have been wondering, why is Nikki Haley still in this race? What more does she have to gain after losing race after race after race? And I think it's less about her now winning the nomination, given that she's polling at just 15% nationwide and very clearly behind Donald Trump in plenty of early states, like Iowa, where she lost and got third place, like New Hampshire, where she lost, like South Carolina, where she lost her own home state, right, where she lost in the state of Nevada to none of these candidates. Literally no one beat Nikki Haley, and somehow she still lost. And in the state of Michigan, we just saw exactly what, was a consequential victory for Donald Trump. But I think it's less about this and more about exposing what is wrong with Donald Trump as the potential nominee. And so what we find here too is that Nikki Haley staying in the race is less about her winning the nomination, and again, just more about figuring out, what he's doing wrong and what this is showing by the fact that she is still getting a significant chunk of the vote, even though this primary has practically wrapped up. What the Michigan results show is that in a state like this one, around 1 in 4 Republican voters do not want Donald Trump to be the nominee. While Nikki Haley does have some support on her own, she did outperform the polls quite significantly, might I add, and the margin that was expected to be here was narrowed down by 10 to 20 points compared to what the polls had predicted earlier on. And while it was still a very strong victory for Donald Trump, at the end of the day, 1 in 4 Republicans decided that they wanted somebody else, even with everybody out of the race, like Governor DeSantis, like Vivek Ramaswamy, like candidates that might have been pulling away from a similar base as Donald Trump. But this 29%, or this 27% is very much an anti-Trump vote, right? You're talking about a chunk of the electorate here that just given another option, even if it is Nikki Haley or to their benefit, maybe they want Nikki Haley, right? Regardless, they want her and not him. And so it does show, the real threat that Donald Trump has facing him this coming November, that there may be a factor in which Haley supporters and these never Trump Republicans who have been against him in 2016, held their nose and voted for him in 2016, were iffy about it in 2020 but wanted to maintain Republican leadership here. But now that they've been given a voice on the Republican side for the first time since 2016, and while it may not be capturing the majority of the party, it is capturing a non-insignificant number, or a significant number is a better way of putting that, very obviously. A significant chunk of Republicans here are looking at this and saying, there should be somebody else. And I think the other thing, too, about Nikki Haley refusing to say she's bound by this pledge to support the party's nominee here is putting pressure a lot on the Trump campaign to try to shift a little bit more towards the center. I think what the Trump campaign genuinely believes right now, incorrectly, is that this election has been wrapped up, that it's about running up the margin rather than it is about winning the election. And I think that while there are numbers out there that do show Donald Trump in a very good position, a very strong position, I'm also reminded that Nikki Haley, number one, is expected to do better than Joe Biden if she eventually gets to the nomination and represents the GOP on the national front this coming November. But also, there can absolutely be shifts and movement if Nikki Haley decides to go out there and say, Donald Trump isn't the right person to be our president. And with Donald Trump being relentless against Nikki Haley in recent attacks, ramping up the comments, calling her bird brain, going after her husband, going after her family, going after her reason for being in the race, attacking her in her own home state. I mean, it is point after point after point here that I think the relationship has been severed so strongly that I do not think, one, for sure, that Nikki Haley is no longer in that VP shortlist like she might have been 4 or 5 months ago. But also now, he may have fallen out of her graces to a point where she just simply doesn't endorse anyone, or God forbid, for the GOP, she endorses Joe Biden. Now, Nikki Haley actually deciding that she's not going to support the eventual nominee, or saying she's no longer, bound or compelled to eventually support the nominee, also should be a worrisome, metric here, because taking a look at where we were in New Hampshire and in Iowa, you have a huge chunk of voters here that just say, if I'm voting for Haley in the primary or in the caucus, I'm voting for Biden in the general election if she is not the nominee. Roughly 43% of Nikki Haley's supporters in the state of Iowa on caucus day said they would vote for Biden over Trump. A very similar amount in New Hampshire, where she got nearly 50% of the vote in this state, say that they would vote for Biden against Trump, and that they don't want to vote for Donald Trump. Either it's a lack of enthusiasm, they don't turn out for Donald Trump, or they turn out and vote for Joe Biden, as was suggested and as these many Republicans endorsed Joe Biden in the 2020 election, despite running alongside the Republican candidate list in 2016. People like Carly Fiorina, people like John Kasich, prominent figures. John Kasich, who was the third place candidate in the 2016 Democratic-Republican primaries here, spoke at the 2020 Democratic Convention. There were plenty of Republicans in 2020 who said they were endorsing and supporting Joe Biden. You know what happened in the election? Joe Biden ended up winning. And I think this is also just a problem here for Donald Trump, that alienating this section of the GOP just isn't going to do you any good. We talked about this in a more extensive and longer video just 2 days ago about the Michigan Republican primary here, but there absolutely are points of concern based on Donald Trump's performance. 68% would be impressive if he was treated as a non-incumbent, or this was a multi-way race, but it was a head-to-head race in a state where he should have been and was polling around 78 to 80%. But just looking at parts of the state where Donald Trump did in fact perform the worst, Washtenaw County, Ingham County, Kalamazoo County, Kent County, regions of the state where you see major movements in favor of Nikki Haley, and just so happens to be in the same areas of the state that used to be there for Republicans. For example, Kent County used to be a Republican stronghold here. Mitt Romney won here by a huge amount. Joe Biden ended up winning in 2020. But these swings in these districts came because a lot of the Republicans here, the Republican primary votes for Nikki Haley, were from moderate people who may have been willing to vote for Republicans in the past when it was the party of Mitt Romney, when it was the party of John Kasich. But now that it is the party of Donald Trump, 2016, 2020, and 2024, these regions of the state have shifted. And as I showed you in Iowa, and as I showed you in New Hampshire, this is a consistent trend we are beginning to see from the Nikki Haley camp, that they are unwilling to vote for Donald Trump in the eventual election. And with her polling at 15% nationwide, 21% in the most recent poll from the New York Times and Siena College, that's a huge chunk of the Republican electorate here. And that would make a difference if you got to the eventual election. And so I think Nikki Haley won. If things were to go perfectly for the Trump campaign, she would drop out today and endorse Donald Trump tomorrow. She would give it some time for these supporters to say, we supported Haley, but we ultimately have the mission here of defeating Joe Biden. Now I no longer think that is the fundamental mission that Nikki Haley genuinely believes. I think there is still absolutely a way she does endorse Donald Trump. But why not, why leave that up to speculation unless there was some consideration that she was not going to? I think this is going to be used as a ploy to scare the RNC to pivot the platform more towards what Nikki Haley wants and less towards extremism that Donald Trump represents. I think that's what this might be ultimately, trying to do here is shift the way Republicans approach this election, because clearly Nikki Haley is doing something right. When you take a look at the polls of the 2024 election, Donald Trump leads by 2.3% in a head-to-head race against President Biden. But when it comes down to Nikki Haley, she leads by an average of 5.1%. She does tremendously better amongst independent voters quite literally every single time, and that's really good for Nikki Haley. But based on where we are in terms of the relationship between Haley and Trump, it is less good news for Donald Trump. Because if Nikki Haley comes out there and says, don't vote in that general election, or vote for anybody but Trump, or God forbid for the GOP's sake, vote for Joe Biden, you are going to see movement. Because right now the assumption is that the Republicans are all together. If it's not Haley, it's going to be Trump, and people are going to begrudgingly support him. But could you imagine what would happen if Nikki Haley fractures this party seemingly intentionally, goes out against the Republican Party establishment here, goes out against Donald Trump? There's one thing about not endorsing or just endorsing begrudgingly and moving on with your life, compared to actually getting out there and actively campaigning for somebody else, with somebody else, or against your own party. And Nikki Haley seems like she might be willing to do exactly that. She hasn't had a good experience running for president against her former boss. She has seen hits at her character, at her family, at her track record, racist comments, sexist comments. She has endured a lot of things in putting herself out there, in a very similar way that Nikki Haley had and any other woman before her. Kamala Harris, people all across, right? Dating all the way back even to Shirley Chisholm's presidential bid. And so what I think you find on this Republican side is that Nikki Haley might feel so jaded by the comments being made by the Trump surrogates, the attacks being made by the former president himself, and the refusal to pressure Trump to debate, the refusal to acknowledge Trump's wrongdoings on the RNC front might be turning her away from this party right now. I think she has seen a failure on the side of the GOP to intervene where they see necessary. And I think what she knows in her heart, and what I think many Republicans do too, is that consistently Nikki Haley does better than Donald Trump. That she is the better nominee for the 2024 general election, yet can't even seem to get a major endorsement on her side. She just got one from Senator Lisa Murkowski and Senator Susan Collins, but that is pretty much it. A lot of the endorsements that had been held out are not going to come through because she's not polling too well, and people know that supporting the wrong presidential candidate in some cases can absolutely be political suicide. I'm interested to see, though, what Nikki Haley decides to do moving forward. Will she drop out? Will she not? It looks like she might have a chance at doing well in some of the Super Tuesday states, which is set to take place, and guess what? Just around 2 days. It'll be very interesting to watch these election results pour in. It'll be fascinating to see what decision she decides to make at the end of the evening on Tuesday, whether she stays in the race or not. That is entirely up to her, and I wouldn't be surprised either way. What I am surprised, though, is this refusal to acknowledge the RNC pledge that she signed on to when she first came into this race. But I think this is the first step of many that we might be seeing Nikki Haley detracting herself from the mainstream GOP, from the Make America Great Again wing of the GOP, and genuinely speaking out against President Donald Trump. Time and time will pass, and we will see what happens. Months will go on, and Nikki Haley will make a conscious decision herself. I think we will find that should she come out against Donald Trump, the numbers will shift nationally, not tremendously, but in favor of the Democratic Party. And given what we're entering into in the summer and the fall, the numbers actually might look a lot better for Democrats if Nikki Haley holds out support for Donald Trump. But again, that seems to be less and less likely given that fundamentally she is a Republican and still very much opposes President Biden. But the question is now, has Donald Trump done more to piss her off? Has Donald Trump done more to lose her support? And that answer will soon come. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below, subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.